Welcome. We have every possibility of concluding this chapter this evening. The fourth chapter in the second book in the Life Divine, the Divine and the Undivine. You recall that he began with this jarring recognition that the world that we see, which we presume to be derived from a divine reality, seems not to possess divine existence at its core, seems to be unconscious, inconscient, ignorant, to be full of suffering, indifference, all the things which stand in contradistinction to what the divine must be in its own real nature. If that supreme reality exists, then it is a conscious existence. Its nature is Ananda. So why don't we find it here? Why do we find a world limited in scope, in consciousness, in its experience of itself? Why is it so perplexed and confounded? So Sri Aurobindo has gone through a long argument demonstrating that it is not an accident that there is a divine will operative in its condensation of its infinity into a limited scope, but not absent its own presence in the universe. If the universe is fashioned, it is fashioned from its own being. And if it exists within the larger being of the divine. But in a way that is a significant expression of it, but a beginning expression. And the second proposition is that this conscious power, which is native to divine existence, is operative in the world. So knowledge cannot be absent, but it can be veiled. It can ignore from its universal stasis what its ultimate existence might be beyond time and space. And here function on the basis of ignorance. Because ignorance is a kind of self-forgetful knowledge, and knowledge is a branding of the divine consciousness itself. And so too he has been arguing that if we experience suffering in the world, it is not a denial of the all delight which is present, but something that is consistently and always there. But we have to dig to find it. It is secret in us, it is secret in the universal processes. And this is where we find ourselves at the beginning of this next paragraph. But let's go back to the end of the last paragraph for a little bit of context. He says, at every turn, it is the divine reality which we can discover behind that which we are yet compelled by the nature of the superficial consciousness in which we dwell to call undivine, and in a sense are right in using that appellation. For these appearances are a veil over the divine perfection, a veil necessary for the present, but not at all the true and complete figure. So there is a self-limitation of the Supreme in its experience of delight in the universe. But why? We can't simply erase this fact. We have to acknowledge it. And so he comes to this in the next paragraph. But even when we thus regard the universe, we cannot and ought not to dismiss as entirely and radically false and unreal the values that are given to it by our own limited human consciousness. For grief, pain, suffering, error, falsehood, ignorance weakness, wickedness, incapacity, non-doing of what should be done, and wrongdoing, deviation of will and denial of will, egoism, limitation, division from other beings with whom we should be one, all that makes up the effective figure of what we call evil are facts of the world consciousness, not fictions and unrealities, although they are facts whose complete sense or true value is not that which we assign to them in our ignorance. So he affirms their limited scope within a larger context. Yes, all is the play of Satchit-Anda, but we cannot, by affirming that, ignore the realities of the ignorance that meets our vision and experience. We have to see it for what it is, and then square it in this larger context that he will be developing. Still, he writes, our sense of them is part of a true sense. Our values of them are necessary to their complete values. One side of the truth of these things we discover when we get into a deeper and larger consciousness, for we find then that there is a cosmic and individual utility in what presents itself to us as adverse and evil. So this deeper and larger consciousness cannot simply be the release from world consciousness. It can't simply be moksha, in which we divorce ourselves from the world and, like the drop, merge, blend ourselves back into the ocean and lose our individuality in all consciousness. Must be a level of experience that he speaks of here, which incorporates the worldview, which accepts the cosmos as a divine reality. It is that kind of a deeper experience that he refers to. For without experience of pain, we would not get all the infinite value of the divine delight of which pain is in travail. Travail is a word that means something like the labor of childbirth or excessive labor. It comes from an old Latin word which means an instrument of torture. So it is a very difficult experience, a travail. All ignorance, he says, is a penumbra. And a penumbra is usually a lighter shadow around a darker shadow, but in this case, Sri Aurobindo reverses it. It's the shadow around a greater light of knowledge. All ignorance is a penumbra which environs an orb of knowledge. Every error is significant of the possibility and the effort of a discovery of truth. Every weakness and failure is a first sounding of gulfs of power and potentiality. All division is intended to enrich by an experience of various sweetness of unification, the joy of realized unity. All this imperfection is to us evil, but all evil is in travail of the eternal good. For all is an imperfection, which is the first condition in the law of life evolving out of inconscience for a greater perfection in the manifesting of the hidden divinity. So the conclusion of a universal process justifies itself. The conclusion reveals what was secretly potential. The process begins, rises into consciousness, into limitation. We find the division, we find the suffering, we find the error, but we push beyond it and transcend and ultimately get to that thing which was secret within it. And here he says, imperfection is the law of life, but evolving towards a greater perfection. And perfection, Sri Aurobindo and Mother have characterized as not something which is not unexceedable, but which is the balance of all elements at their utmost at that moment. But every state of perfection can be exceeded by a still greater state of perfection. There is no final perfection. In an infinite universe expressing an infinite reality, perfection follows perfection. Dawn follows dawn. Truth emerges and is a greater truth. But, he writes, at the same time, our present feeling of this evil and imperfection, the revolt of our consciousness against them, is also a necessary valuation. For if we have first to face and endure them, the ultimate command on us is to reject, to overcome, to transform the life and nature. It is for that end that their insistence is not allowed to slacken. The soul must learn the results of the ignorance, must begin to feel their reactions as a spur to its endeavor of mastery and conquest, and finally to a greater endeavor of transformation and transcendence. So, feel, endure, master, conquer, transform. These are all yogic steps. Sri Aurobindo here has equated this process with yoga and by implication with the nature of the cosmic evolution. So the evolving cosmos is itself undertaking yoga and revealing its inner truths. Just in our life, we dig inside, we find the secret of our soul and manifest in all of our nature. So too, we are key to the universe doing that. We have a defined and indispensable purpose in that regard. He says, it is possible when we live inwardly in the depths to arrive at a state of vast inner equality and peace which is untouched by the reactions of the outer nature. And that is a great but incomplete liberation. For the outer nature too has a right to deliverance. But even if our personal deliverance is complete, still there is the suffering of others, the world travail, which the great of soul cannot regard with indifference. There is a unity with all beings, with which something within us feels, and the deliverance of others must be felt as intimate to its own deliverance. So moksha, nirvana are ineffective for the body's life. And more, there is a collective dimension in which the soul who is striving towards personal perfection recognizes and sees that his own perfection, her own perfection, is not final until all are brought into it. If that communion is possible for the individual soul and the Supreme, then it is possible for the all soul and the Supreme. And the individual must first carve the path that reaches it, but must find a pathway back which liberates the body and then stretches endlessly that realization to all around. So he has just drawn the picture of a much vaster yoga, just in a few sentences and by philosophic implication, than we usually regard when we think of the practice of yoga. Personal escape from suffering. An insufficient formula to Sri Aurobindo's grand vision. This, then, is the law of the manifestation, the reason of the imperfection here. True, it is a law of manifestation only, and even a law special to this movement in which we live, and we may say that it need not have been if there were no movement of manifestation, or not this movement, but the manifestation and the movement being given, the law is necessary. It is not enough simply to say that the law and all its circumstances are an unreality created by the mental consciousness, non-existent in God, and to be indifferent to these dualities or to get out of the manifestation into God's pure being is the only wisdom. It is true they are creations of mind consciousness, but mind is only secondarily responsible. In a deeper reality, they are, as we have seen already, creations of the divine consciousness projecting mind away from its all-knowledge so as to realize these opposite or contrary values of its all-power, all-knowledge, all-delight, all-being, and unity. So the divine has intentionally invested itself in what seems to be the opposites of its own nature in order to have this graded ascent towards perfection, this movement from maximum disintegration towards reintegration. And he'll tell us why, still more, that this is justified to the divine view. But he writes here, so as to realize these opposites. To realize means to make real. That's its first meaning. So he describes here this descent of a supreme consciousness through the agency of an all-knowledge. Drawing from that all-knowledge is this mind which operates as a kind of vicegerent in the universe. It is not the creative consciousness, but it, in a sense, receives the inspiration, the vision of this great all-knowledge, and translates that through its power of concentration and focusing into the world realities that we experience. Mind is a Levantine aperture through which that divine light descends into manifestation. A refractory agency is the mind's, but still it is derived from that all-knowledge, that all-light. And so, in that descent, we see the opposites arise from what is all-powerful, the divine tapas, what is all-knowing, the vijnana, the great consciousness of the divine, the all-delight, the ananda. Obviously, he writes, this action and these fruits of the divine consciousness can be called by us unreal in the sense of not being the eternal and fundamental truth of being, or can be taxed with falsehood because they contradict what is originally and eventually the truth of being. But all the same, they have their persistent reality and importance in our present phase of the manifestation, nor can they be a mere mistake of the divine consciousness without any meaning in the divine wisdom, without any purpose of the divine joy, power, and knowledge to justify their existence. Justification there must be, even if it reposes for us upon a mystery which may confront us, so long as we live in a surface experience as an insoluble riddle. And this is the external mind's position, looking from outside in, trying to gain insight into what is at the heart of this world machinery. As he suggested, we cannot get that without a deeper experience, without a knowledge of self, without a deeper knowledge of world, without finding our identity in both, in that which is beyond. Until then, the mind is stumped. It's a philosophic riddle. But if accepting this side of nature, we say that all things are fixed in their statutory and stationary law of being, and man too must be fixed in his imperfections, his ignorance and sin and weakness and vileness and suffering, our life loses its true significance. In other words, if we accept that the world must behave according to the law as written that we understand, that's what statutory means. And stationary, in other words, there is no real development, no ascent, we're always at the same level. Then there's no exit from this. Man's perpetual attempt to arise out of the darkness and insufficiency of his nature can then have no issue in the world itself and life itself. Its one issue, if there is any, must be by an escape out of life, out of the world, out of his human existence, and therefore out of its eternally unsatisfactory law of imperfect being, either into a heaven of the gods, or of God, or into the pure ineffability of the Absolute. So here he's drawn our attention back by implication to the very first chapter of the book, the human aspiration, and to its second and third chapter. The third chapter is the refusal of the ascetic. Because if we can't achieve that, if there is no issue from it, then all we can do is escape from the world. Find a means by which we can elude the grasp of nature. He continues, if so, man can never really deliver out of the ignorance and falsehood the truth and knowledge, out of the evil and ugliness, the good and beauty, out of the weakness and vileness, the power and glory, out of the grief and suffering, the joy and delight which are contained in the spirit behind them, and of which these contradictions are the first adverse and contrary conditions of emergence. So, if nature is intransigent, and we cannot change, then there is no exit. The universe has no fulfillable purpose. The world would have been set up by the divine wrongly. This is not his position. This is not his final statement. All he can do, he writes, is to cut the imperfections away from him and overpass to their balancing opposites, imperfect also. Leave with the ignorance the human knowledge, with the evil the human good, with the weakness the human strength and power, with the strife and suffering the human love and joy. For these are in our present nature inseparably entwined together, look like conjoint dualities, negative pole and positive pole of the same unreality. And since they cannot be elevated and transformed, they must be both abandoned. Humanity cannot be fulfilled in divinity. It must cease, be left behind, and rejected. So whatever we have gained in terms of knowledge, experience, has to be jettisoned. If there is no issue out of this world, then we have to leave it behind and place ourselves in that and abandon all gains henceforth made. Whether the result will be an individual enjoyment of the absolute divine nature or of the divine presence or a nirvana in the featureless absolute is a point on which religions and philosophies differ. But in either case, human existence on earth must be taken as condemned to eternal imperfection by the very law of its being. It is perpetually and unchangeably an undivine manifestation in the divine existence. The soul, by taking on manhood, perhaps by the very fact of birth itself, has fallen from the divine, has committed an original sin or error, which it must be man's spiritual aim, as soon as he is enlightened, thoroughly to cancel, unflinchingly to eliminate. Well, his point is, this is if the world is intractable, cannot be changed, and we cannot change the law of our own nature. If we're stuck in this kind of ignorance, and the divine is unredeemably lost to our experience in the world, then yes, erase it all, let's go. In that case, the only reasonable explanation of such a paradoxical manifestation or creation is that it is a cosmic game, a lila, a play, an amusement of the divine being. Because it's an ultimately futile manifestation, it must be otherwise only a play. It may be he pretends to be undivine, wears that appearance like the mask or makeup of an actor for the sole pleasure of the pretense or the drama, or else he has created the undivine, created ignorance, sin, and suffering just for the joy of a manifold creation. Or perhaps, as some religions curiously suppose, he has done this so that there may be inferior creatures who will praise and glorify him for his eternal goodness, wisdom, bliss, and omnipotence, and try feebly to come an inch nearer to the goodness in order to share the bliss on pain of punishment by some supposed eternal, if, as the vast majority must, by their very imperfection, they fail in their endeavor. But to the doctrine of such a lila so crudely stated, there is always possible the retort that a God himself all blissful, who delights in the suffering of creatures or imposes such suffering on them for the faults of his own imperfect creation, would be no divinity. And against him, the moral being and intelligence of humanity must revolt or deny his existence. For surely such a God is a monster. And theistic religions have indeed this problem at their core, by dividing God from nature and saying, that is real and this is false, that is good and this is evil, and then how to explain the connection. But if the human soul is a portion of the divinity, if it is a divine spirit in man that puts on this imperfection and in the form of humanity consents to bear this suffering, or if the soul in humanity is meant to be drawn to the divine spirit and is his associate in the play of imperfection here, in the delight of perfect being otherwhere, the lila may still remain a paradox, but it ceases to be a cruel or revolting paradox. It can at most be regarded as a strange mystery and to the reason inexplicable. To explain it, there must be two missing elements: a conscious assent by the soul to this manifestation, and a reason in the all-wisdom that makes the play significant and intelligible. So he comes to this. Why does the soul agree to come to the cosmos? And what divine purpose might be working out through this inexplicable process? The strangeness of the play diminishes. The paradox loses its edge of sharpness if we discover that, although fixed grades exist, each with its appropriate order of nature, they are only firm steps for a progressive ascent of the souls embodied in forms of matter, a progressive divine manifestation which rises from the inconscient to the superconscient, or all-conscient status, with the human consciousness as its decisive point of transition. So these fixed grades, again, would be matter, life, and mind. These are the ones apprehendable to our experience, the ones which are so perplexing to the ascending, questing human spirit. So they are a grade of steps that lead from the inconscious, that which actually lies below matter, to the superconscious, that which rises into true divine being and self-awareness. So they are fixed but progressive. In other words, they're firmly established, but we're able to step on them like on a staircase and rise from level to level. This is the ascent of the soul. Imperfection, he says, becomes then a necessary term of the manifestation, for since all the divine nature is concealed but present in the inconscient, it must be gradually delivered out of it. This graduation necessitates a partial unfolding, and this partial character or incompleteness of the unfolding necessitates imperfection. We move, as Sri Aurobindo would say in another context, from the near to the far. Why all at once? We will proceed gradually. An evolutionary manifestation demands a mid-stage with gradations above and under it. Precisely such a stage as the mental consciousness of man, part knowledge, part ignorance, a middle power of being still leaning on the inconscient but slowly rising towards the all-conscious divine nature. A partial unfolding implying imperfection and ignorance may take as its inevitable companion, perhaps its basis for certain movements, an apparent perversion of the original truth of being. For the ignorance or imperfection to endure, there must be a seeming contrary of all that characterizes the divine nature. It's unity, it's all consciousness, it's all power, it's all harmony, it's all good, it's all delight. There must appear limitation, discord, unconsciousness, disharmony, incapacity, insensibility, and suffering, evil. For without that perversion, imperfection could have no strong standing ground, could not so freely manifest and maintain its nature as against the presence of the underlying divinity. So it needs that darkness to stand upon, to be sure of it. If it were always melting away back into the divinity which is behind, if it were immediately apparent, you couldn't have the basis of the universe. You couldn't have the fulfillable stages, one after the other, leading forward. You'd be tempted to dissolve back into that homogeneous being just behind the surface. You'd break through the skin of the milk and find that ocean of milk behind it. So, the gradations have to be a little sharp, have to be a little hard, have to be a little dark. The divine has to station itself as if it were its opposite for the universal play to be fulfilled. There's a divine reason behind it. A partial knowledge is imperfect knowledge, and imperfect knowledge is to that extent ignorance, a contrary of the divine nature. But in its outlook on what is beyond its knowledge, this contrary negative becomes a contrary positive. It originates error, wrong knowledge, wrong dealing with things, with life, with action. The wrong knowledge becomes a wrong will in the nature. At first it may be wrong by mistake, but afterwards wrong by choice, by attachment, by delight in the falsehood. The simple contrary turns into a complex perversion. Inconscience and ignorance, once admitted, these form a natural result in a logical sequence and have to be admitted also as necessary factors. The only question is the reason why this kind of progressive manifestation was itself necessary. That is the sole point left obscure to the intelligence. So, if we grant the power of the divine to conceal itself in its apparent opposite, then that first act which allows it to ignore itself as it becomes universal. It becomes a power of ignorance, which then can pursue its own tail. You made an error, but then you decide you like the error. That becomes perverse and develops towards falsehood and evil. But all is not lost. Let it develop. There is a secret waiting to manifest at the basis of the universe, which will eradicate these perplexities, these confounding circumstances of the world, and restore us to an ultimate harmony. Be patient. The game is only partly played. He continues, a manifestation of this kind, self-creation or lila, would not seem justifiable if it were imposed on the unwilling creature. But it will be evident that the assent of the embodied spirit must be there already, for Prakriti cannot act without the assent of the Purusha. So here, Sri Aurobindo securely establishes a link between his philosophy and the view of Sankhya, that it is by dint of Purusha's sanctioning gaze that Prakriti is at all able to act. That is the consent of the witness spirit that compels nature to move. Consciousness and power are one and the same thing, chit, tapas. Here in this world they seem to be divided. We can watch something and not have control over it, but most deeply the spirit does command nature, can send forth a sanction, anumanta, and demand that Purusha, in its executive command, be effectively discharged in acting nature. There must have been, he writes, not only the will of the divine Purusha to make the cosmic creation possible, but the assent of the individual Purusha to make the individual manifestation possible. Put simply, the individual personal soul is here at its own choice, has not been compelled to birth in the universe, but has chosen to be born here. But it may be said that the reason for the divine will and delight in such a difficult and tormented progressive manifestation, and the reason for the soul's assent to it, is still a mystery. But it is not altogether a mystery if we look at our own nature and can suppose some kindred movement of being in the beginning as its cosmic origin. Remember, microcosm and macrocosm share a common nature. They are both expressions of Sat Chit Ananda. One in the large, one in the small. They have the same reality inside them. So if we can find, as we look within, that we have assented, that we have said, yes, let me dive into this universe for the play, for the joy, for the adventure, so has the universal being said, I will accept this robe of inconscience and let us see what we can work out in the long play of eons. And this is something that we can remember in our own deep being. We don't have to take this on faith. We don't have to accept this simply as an ennobling idea or something inspirational. But you can, in sounding the depths of your own soul, recall that moment where you looked from above, below, and said, yes, I'll come. I'm going there. Do you want to go too? Let's go together. On the contrary, a play of self-concealing and self-finding is one of the most strenuous joys that conscious being can give to itself, a play of extreme attractiveness. There is no greater pleasure for man himself than a victory which is in its very principle a conquest over difficulties, a victory in knowledge, a victory in power, a victory in creation over the impossibilities of creation, a delight in the conquest over an anguished toil and a hard ordeal of suffering. At the end of separation is the intense joy of union, the joy of a meeting with a self from which we were divided. There is an attraction in ignorance itself because it provides us with the joy of discovery, the surprise of new and unforeseen creation, a great adventure of the soul. There is a joy of the journey and the search and the finding, a joy of the battle and the crown, the labor and the reward of labor. If delight of existence be the secret of creation, this too is one delight of existence. It can be regarded as the reason, or at least one reason, of this apparently paradoxical and contrary Leela. But apart from this choice of the individual Purusha, there is a deeper truth inherent in the original existence which finds its expression in the plunge into inconscience. Its result is a new affirmation of Satchit Ananda in its apparent opposite. If the infinite's right of various self-manifestation is granted, this too, as a possibility of its manifestation, is intelligible and has its profound significance. Of course, when we read these words, we're reminded of that great line in Savitri from Sri Aurobindo, where he describes all this as the adventure of consciousness and joy. He has here written of it as a great adventure of the soul. Remember that when this was published, Savitri had not been published. It was years in the future. A few may have read some of its passages, very few. But the grand vision of Savitri had not been made public. So this closing point, where we've described what is the truth of the individual's entry into the cosmos, is one thing, but the larger point is that this is the affirmation of Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, in what seems to be the denial of its own being, of its own rich self-awareness, of its own rich self-experience of delight, bliss. So we've come to the end of this chapter, and for the next several weeks we'll be dealing with the cosmic illusion. Long chapters await us. Having spoken of Savitri, though, the adventure of consciousness and joy, let's come back and conclude this passage we've been reading from, which is evocative of the themes that we've been reading in the Life Divine. We're in the Book of Beginnings, Book 1, in Canto 4, The Secret Knowledge. Too seldom is the shadow of what must come cast in an instant on the secret sense, which feels the shock of the invisible, and seldom in the few who answer give, the mighty process of the cosmic will communicates its image to our sight, identifying the world's mind with ours. Our range is fixed within the crowded arc of what we observe and touch and thought can guess, and rarely dawns the light of the unknown, waking in us the prophet and the seer. The outward and the immediate are our field. The dead past is our background and support. Mind keeps the soul prisoner. We are slaves to our acts. We cannot free our gaze to reach wisdom's sun. Inheritor of the brief animal mind, Man, still a child in nature's mighty hands, in the succession of the moments lives. To a changing present is his natural right. His memory stares back at a phantom past. The future flees before him as he moves. He sees imagined garments, not a face. Armed with a limited, precarious strength, he saves his fruits of work from adverse chance. A struggling ignorance is his wisdom's mate. He waits to see the consequence of his acts. He waits to weigh the certitude of his thoughts. He knows not what he shall achieve or when. He knows not whether at last he shall survive, or end like the mastodon and the sloth, and perish from the earth where he was king. He is ignorant of the meaning of his life. He is ignorant of his high and splendid fate. Only the immortals on their deathless heights, dwelling beyond the walls of time and space, masters of living, free from the bonds of thought, who are overseers of fate and chance and will, and experts of the theorem of world need, can see the idea, the might that changed time's course, come maimed with light from undiscovered worlds. Here, while the world toils on with its deep blind heart, the galloping hooves of the unforeseen event, bearing the superhuman rider, near and impassive to earth's din and startled cry, return to the silence of the hills of God. As lightning leaps, as thunder sweeps, they pass, and leave their mark on the trampled breast of life. Above the world creators stand. In the phenomenon, see its mystic source. These heed not the deceiving outward play. They turn not to the moment's busy tramp, but listen with the still patience of the unborn for the slow footsteps of far destiny, approaching through huge distances of time, unmarked by the eye that sees effect and cause, unheard mid the clamor of the human plain. Attentive to an unseen truth, they seize a sound as of invisible augur wings, voices of an unplumbed significance, mutterings that brood in the core of matter's sleep. In the heart's profound audition, they can catch the murmurs lost by life's uncaring ear, a prophet's speech in thought's omniscient trance. Above the illusion of the hopes that pass, behind the appearance and the overt act, behind this clockwork chance and vague surmise, amid the wrestle of force, the trampling feet, across the cries of anguish and of joy, across the triumph, fighting and despair, they watch the bliss for which earth's heart has cried on the long road which cannot see its end, winding undetected through the skeptic days, and to meet it guide the unheedful moving world. Thus will the masked transcendent mount his throne. When darkness deepens, strangling the earth's breast, and man's corporeal mind is the only lamp, as a thief's in the night shall be the covert tread of one who steps unseen into his house. A voice ill heard shall speak, the soul obey, a power into mind's inner chambers steal, a charm and sweetness open life's closed doors, and beauty conquer the resisting world. The truth light capture nature by surprise, a stealth of God compel the heart to bliss, and earth grow unexpectedly divine. In matter shall be lit the Spirit's glow, in body and body kindled the sacred birth. Night shall awake to the anthem of the stars, the days become a happy pilgrim march, our will a force of the Eternal's power, and thought the rays of a spiritual sun. A few shall see what none yet understands. God shall grow up while the wise men talk and sleep. For man shall not know the coming till its hour, and belief shall be not till the work is done. Namaste. Jai Ma. Until our next